Darcey always believed she could handle it. Handle the comparisons. Handle the whispers. Handle the quiet way people looked past her and focused on Stacey instead. For years, she told herself she was strong enough to stand beside her twin sister without feeling smaller. But the night Stacey's marriage became undeniable reality, something inside Darcey finally cracked. It wasn't a loud argument. There were no screaming matches or dramatic walkouts. What made this moment so devastating was how quiet it was. Stacey sat there, calm, confident, wearing the kind of peace Darcey had been chasing her entire life. A wedding ring on her finger. A future that finally looked settled. And across from her sat Darcey, smiling on the surface, but unraveling on the inside. For Darcey, this wasn't just about Stacey getting married. It was about what that marriage symbolized. Proof that Stacey had crossed a finish line Darcey had been running toward for years, and never reached. Every failed engagement. Every public breakup. Every promise that fell apart right before becoming real. In that moment, Stacey's happiness felt less like celebration and more like a mirror, reflecting everything Darcey feared about herself. She tried to stay composed. Darcey has always been good at that. Putting on lashes, confidence, and bravado like armor. Telling the world she's strong, worthy, and ready for love. But as Stacey talked about stability, commitment, and building a life, Darcey's eyes gave her away. They weren't jealous, they were exhausted. Tired of hoping. Tired of starting over. Tired of believing that next time would finally be her time. What hurt the most wasn't that Stacey had found love. It was that Stacey had found certainty. Something Darcey has never been given. Every relationship Darcey entered came with conditions, doubts, delays, and ultimatums. Men who promised forever but hesitated when it mattered. Men who loved her intensity until it required commitment. Watching Stacey stand confidently in her choice forced Darcey to confront a brutal question she'd avoided for years. What if the problem wasn't bad luck, but a pattern she couldn't escape? And that realization was terrifying. Because for the first time, Darcey wasn't angry at a man. She wasn't blaming circumstances or timing. She was staring directly at her own reflection, stripped of excuses, stripped of hope-filled fantasies. Stacey's marriage didn't just highlight Darcey's loneliness, it exposed her deepest fear, that wanting love more than anything might be the very thing pushing it away. As the room filled with quiet conversation, Darcey felt herself emotionally shrinking. The twin bond they once shared, equal, inseparable, suddenly felt uneven. Stacey had moved forward. Darcey felt stuck. And no amount of positivity or self-talk could erase the ache settling in her chest. This was the moment Darcey realized something painful but unavoidable. She couldn't outrun comparison anymore. She couldn't hide behind confidence. And she couldn't keep pretending that Stacey's happiness didn't reopen wounds she never truly healed. This wasn't just heartbreak. This was reckoning. Darcey never wanted to compete with Stacey. At least, that's what she told herself. Growing up as twins meant everything was shared: birthdays, clothes, milestones, attention. But as adults, something shifted. The comparisons didn't stop, they just became quieter, sharper, and far more painful. Stacey's marriage didn't arrive suddenly. It was built step by step: commitment, follow-through, decisions made without hesitation. And each step forward for Stacey felt like a step backward for Darcey. Not because Darcey didn't want her sister to be happy, but because happiness kept choosing Stacey while Darcey kept waiting. Waiting became Darcey's pattern. Waiting for men to change. Waiting for proposals that never came. Waiting for reassurance that always arrived too late. As Stacey talked confidently about her future, Darcey's mind drifted to her past. The failed engagements. The public heartbreaks. The moments she convinced herself love was almost there. She remembered every time she lowered her standards just to keep hope alive. Every time she confused intensity with commitment. Every time she fought harder than the relationship ever deserved. What made it worse was Stacey's tone. Not cruel. Not smug. Just settled. The kind of calm that only comes when someone knows they're chosen. That calm cut deeper than any insult ever could. Because Darcey realized she'd never experienced that certainty, not once. And suddenly, the twin dynamic felt unbalanced. Darcey began questioning herself in ways she never admitted out loud. Why does Stacey get stability while I get chaos? Why do my relationships burn hot and collapse fast? Why does love feel like a battle for me, but peace for her? These questions haunted her, especially because the answers weren't simple. Darcey couldn't blame one man, one mistake, or one bad decision. The pattern followed her. And realizing that felt suffocating. For years, Darcey built her identity around being strong, independent, and deserving. But deep down, she was terrified of being left behind, not just romantically, but emotionally. Stacey had grown, settled, grounded herself. Darcey felt like she was still chasing validation from people who never fully chose her. The hardest truth Darcey faced wasn't jealousy. It was grief. Grief for the version of herself she thought she'd be by now. Grief for the life she imagined she'd already have. Watching Stacey live that life forced Darcey to mourn something she never officially lost, but never truly gained. And yet, she smiled. She always smiled. Because Darcey has mastered the art of hiding pain behind confidence. But cracks were forming. Her emotions began slipping out in subtle ways, longer silences, forced laughter, teary eyes she quickly wiped away. Stacey noticed, but didn't know how to address it without making things worse. That's when the unspoken tension began to grow. Two sisters standing side by side, bonded by blood, divided by reality. Stacey's happiness wasn't the cause of Darcey's pain, but it was the trigger that made her finally confront it. This wasn't about rivalry anymore. It was about identity. And Darcey was losing hers. Darcey had always believed that if she just stayed hopeful long enough, love would eventually meet her halfway. That belief carried her through heartbreak after heartbreak. But watching Stacey move forward with certainty did something unexpected. It broke the illusion that time alone would fix everything. For the first time, Darcey couldn't distract herself with optimism. Stacey wasn't rushing. She wasn't begging. She wasn't proving anything. She was simply chosen. And that reality forced Darcey to confront a painful question she had avoided for years. What if the problem isn't bad luck, but the patterns I keep repeating? This question didn't arrive gently. It hit in waves, late at night, during quiet moments, in conversations that suddenly felt too real. Darcey replayed her past relationships with new eyes. The red flags she ignored. The emotional highs she mistook for intimacy. The way she attached quickly, hoping intensity would turn into commitment. The truth was uncomfortable. Darcey often fell in love with potential, not reality. She realized she spent more time trying to be chosen than asking if she was choosing the right person. And that realization shook her sense of self. Because it meant her pain wasn't just something that happened to her, it was something she had unknowingly participated in. Meanwhile, Stacey's presence became a mirror Darcey couldn't avoid. Every conversation about stability felt like a reminder of chaos. Every plan Stacey made highlighted how uncertain Darcey's life still felt. And yet, Stacey never rubbed it in. She didn't have to. The contrast spoke for itself. Darcey's emotions began spilling out in moments she couldn't control. A joke that turned into tears. A comment that sounded defensive when it wasn't meant to. Friends noticed the shift. The confidence that once defined her now felt fragile, like it could shatter at any moment. What made this especially painful was the public nature of it all. Darcey wasn't just struggling privately, she was doing it under a spotlight. Every emotional moment was dissected. Every tear became a headline. And instead of feeling supported, she felt exposed. The breakdown wasn't loud at first. It started quietly, with self-doubt. She began questioning her worth, her desirability, her future. The very things she once spoke about with certainty now felt distant. And for someone who built her identity around believing in love, this internal collapse was devastating. Darcey didn't want Stacey's life. She wanted what Stacey had found: security, consistency, someone who didn't make her question herself. And that longing came with shame. Shame for feeling behind. Shame for feeling envious. Shame for struggling when she was supposed to be strong. But strength doesn't mean never breaking. Sometimes, it means finally admitting you are. And Darcey was dangerously close to that admission. Darcey tried to tell herself she was happy for Stacey. And in many ways, she was. There was genuine love there, pride even. But emotion doesn't always follow logic, and the closer Stacey's marriage became, the harder it was for Darcey to keep her feelings contained. Comparison didn't arrive as jealousy. It arrived as grief. Grief for the life Darcey thought she would already be living. Grief for the version of herself she believed would be settled by now. Grief for every promise she made to herself that hadn't materialized. Each milestone Stacey reached felt like a silent countdown for Darcey. Time suddenly felt louder. More aggressive. Less forgiving. And no amount of positive affirmations could drown it out. The breakdown happened in pieces. A conversation where Darcey laughed too hard, then went quiet. A moment where she insisted she was fine, but couldn't hold eye contact. A night where emotions spilled out with no clear trigger, just years of pressure finally surfacing. What hurt most wasn't Stacey's happiness. It was the feeling of being left behind. Darcey had spent her life believing love would arrive if she stayed open, vulnerable, and hopeful. But now, that belief felt naive. The pattern was undeniable. She kept giving her heart to men who needed fixing, convincing herself that loyalty and effort would eventually turn chaos into commitment. It never did. And seeing Stacey succeed without self-sacrifice forced Darcey to confront a terrifying realization: love doesn't reward effort, it rewards alignment. That truth shattered her. Because it meant her pain wasn't proof of depth, it was proof of imbalance. Darcey began questioning everything. Her instincts, her standards, her self-worth. She wondered if she was drawn to unavailable men because they confirmed a fear she had carried for years, that real, stable love wasn't meant for her. The emotional weight became too heavy to carry quietly. Tears came without warning. Frustration turned into self-criticism. She felt raw, exposed, and deeply confused. And the hardest part? She didn't know how to fix it. Darcey wasn't just breaking down because Stacey was moving forward. She was breaking down because she could no longer ignore herself. This wasn't about competition. It was about confrontation. There comes a moment when emotional pain stops asking politely to be acknowledged. For Darcey, that moment arrived quietly, not in a fight, not in a dramatic confession, but in stillness. She realized she was exhausted. Not from dating. Not from heartbreak. But from hoping. Hope had always been her identity. The woman who believed harder, loved louder, and stayed longer than anyone else. She wore vulnerability like armor, convinced that if she gave enough of herself, love would eventually meet her halfway. But watching Stacey settle into a stable marriage exposed a painful contrast Darcey could no longer ignore. Stacey didn't beg for reassurance. She didn't chase chaos. She didn't confuse intensity with intimacy. And that difference forced Darcey to face an uncomfortable truth. She had been confusing effort with value for years. Darcey began replaying her past relationships with brutal clarity. The red flags she ignored. The boundaries she abandoned. The excuses she made for men who were emotionally unavailable but temporarily passionate. She didn't choose them because she was unlucky. She chose them because they felt familiar. Familiar chaos. Familiar uncertainty. Familiar disappointment. Stability felt foreign to her, almost suspicious. And deep down, Darcey started to understand why. Loving someone who was consistent would require her to believe she deserved consistency. And that belief had always been fragile. This realization didn't empower her immediately. It devastated her. Because it meant the pattern wasn't about timing or fate, it was about self-worth. Darcey wasn't unlucky in love. She was repeating a story she hadn't healed from. For the first time, she stopped blaming circumstances. She stopped blaming men. She stopped blaming Stacey's success. And instead, she turned the lens inward. That's when the breakdown deepened. She cried not because she was alone, but because she finally understood why she kept ending up there. And understanding hurt more than confusion ever had. But inside that pain was something new. Clarity. Darcey began to see that love wasn't supposed to feel like survival. That longing wasn't the same as connection. That being chosen shouldn't feel like something you have to earn. And most importantly, she began to see that her sister's marriage wasn't proof of her failure. It was a mirror. A mirror showing her what was possible, not when you try harder, but when you choose differently. This wasn't Darcey's ending. But it was the end of denial. Change sounds empowering in theory. In reality, it feels like loss. For Darcey, choosing herself didn't arrive as confidence or clarity. It arrived as emptiness. Because when you stop chasing validation, you're left alone with the parts of yourself you used love to avoid. She had built her identity around being desired, pursued, wanted. Romance wasn't just a dream, it was proof. Proof that she was worthy. Proof that she mattered. Proof that she hadn't been left behind. So when Darcey finally accepted that she needed to step back from chasing relationships, it felt like erasing the only version of herself she knew. Who was she without the pursuit? Without the late-night calls? Without the emotional highs and crashes? Without the fantasy of, this one will finally be different? Watching Stacey plan a life grounded in partnership forced Darcey to confront the gap between fantasy and reality. Stacey wasn't perfect. Her marriage wasn't flawless. But it was stable. Intentional. Calm. And calm terrified Darcey. Because calm meant no adrenaline. No chaos to distract her. No uncertainty to justify her anxiety. For the first time, Darcey had to sit with herself, not as a woman waiting to be chosen, but as someone responsible for her own fulfillment. And that was the hardest part. Self-work isn't glamorous. There are no dramatic gestures. No grand declarations. Just uncomfortable honesty and quiet discipline. Darcey had to acknowledge that love wasn't something she needed to win, it was something she needed to allow. That meant setting boundaries. That meant walking away sooner. That meant disappointing people, including herself. And the grief of letting go hit hard. She mourned the version of herself who believed love alone could fix everything. She mourned the years she spent proving instead of protecting. She mourned the belief that suffering was evidence of depth. But grief makes room for truth. And slowly, Darcey began to understand something radical. Choosing herself didn't mean giving up on love. It meant refusing to lose herself in it. Stacey's marriage no longer felt like a threat, it felt like a reminder. A reminder that happiness doesn't come from intensity. It comes from safety. And safety starts within. Darcey wasn't healed yet. But she was finally honest. And honesty is where real change begins. Darcey had always said she wasn't afraid of being alone. She said it confidently, publicly, repeatedly. But the truth was quieter and much heavier. She wasn't afraid of being alone. She was afraid of what being alone might confirm. For years, loneliness felt like failure. Like proof that something about her was fundamentally lacking. Every relationship, no matter how unstable, had protected her from that thought. As long as someone wanted her, even temporarily, she didn't have to sit with the fear that maybe she wasn't enough on her own. Now, without the distraction of chasing love, that fear surfaced fully. And it was brutal. Darcey noticed how silence felt different when it wasn't temporary. How nights stretched longer without anticipation. How self-doubt grew louder without romance to drown it out. This was the emotional terrain she had avoided her entire life, not because she was weak, but because she had never been taught how to exist here without self-judgment. Stacey, in contrast, seemed grounded. Not because she had a partner, but because she wasn't looking to be completed by one. And that difference became painfully clear. Darcey finally understood something essential. Her breakdown wasn't caused by Stacey's marriage. It was caused by the collapse of the illusion that love would save her from herself. That illusion had carried her for decades. Letting it go felt like standing naked in front of her own insecurities, with no distractions left. And yet, something unexpected happened. The fear didn't destroy her. It softened her. Without the constant chase, Darcey began to hear her own needs more clearly. She started recognizing patterns not with shame, but with curiosity. Why did she equate intensity with love? Why did calm feel undeserved? Why did she measure her worth through romantic milestones? These questions didn't have instant answers. But asking them was progress. For the first time, Darcey wasn't trying to prove she was lovable. She was trying to understand herself. And that shift changed everything. Being alone stopped feeling like rejection. It started feeling like space, uncomfortable, yes, but honest. Space where healing could actually happen, instead of being postponed by the next relationship. Darcey hadn't found peace yet. But she had stopped running from herself. And that was the bravest thing she'd ever done. Darcey didn't wake up one morning suddenly healed. There was no dramatic transformation. No moment where everything made sense. What changed was quieter. She stopped chasing closure from other people and started giving it to herself. Stacey's marriage no longer felt like a mirror of her failure. It became proof that love doesn't arrive through force or fantasy. It arrives through alignment. Through choosing partners who meet you where you are, not where you hope they'll become. Darcey finally accepted a truth she had resisted for years. Love isn't supposed to feel like a test you keep failing. It isn't earned through endurance, sacrifice, or suffering. Real love doesn't demand you shrink, perform, or wait indefinitely. And that acceptance hurt, because it required her to grieve the story she had been telling herself for decades. She grieved the belief that intensity meant passion. She grieved the idea that heartbreak proved depth. She grieved the version of herself who thought love had to hurt to matter. But grief made space for something better. Self-trust. Darcey began defining success differently. Not by marriage timelines. Not by comparison. Not by who arrived first, but by emotional safety. By honesty. By peace. And in that shift, something remarkable happened. She stopped feeling behind. Because she finally understood that everyone's timeline is different, and forcing herself into someone else's version of happiness had only delayed her own. Stacey's marriage didn't end Darcey's hope. It refined it. Now, Darcey wasn't looking to be saved. She wasn't searching for validation. She wasn't racing against time. She was choosing presence over pressure. Growth over performance. Peace over pursuit. This wasn't the end of her story. It was the end of the old one. And the brutal reality Darcey faced wasn't that she was alone, it was that she had been abandoning herself for years in the name of love. Once she stopped doing that, everything else finally had a chance to begin. Because the strongest love Darcey ever found was the one she stopped waiting for someone else to give her.